Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the group for inviting me to come to Sydney and talk. I'm actually going to do the talk in several sections. Altogether it's about an hour if I just talk at you. I'd prefer not to do that, so I'll be taking a break after various sections, and we can indulge in good old-fashioned questions, answers and discussion. That way it'll be a bit easier than sitting there for an hour at a time. So I'm going to start my talk today by taking a look at 4 approaches to investigation. Those undertaken by governments, by science, by private enterprise and by civilian UFO groups. On the screen you have a front cover of a report, 1,000 pages long, that was sponsored by the United States Air Force back in the 1960s. And this is one of the few large-scale scientific open government studies ever conducted and published. So first of all, we're going to have a look at the style of investigation that governments undertake. Now, over the years, many world governments have taken a look at the UFO phenomena, and perhaps the most well-known explorations are those of the United States, the United Kingdom and France. However, many other countries, such as Spain, Brazil, New Zealand, and of course Australia, have at times taken a look at this subject. On the screen at the moment is a slide showing the home page of the website of the official French UFO study group, GPAN. If you've never had a look at another government's UFO sightings, files, analysis, you will need to know French to do this, because traditionally, as you know, the French will not speak English. They prefer to use their own language, fine, but just be warned, if you go to this website, there are thousands and thousands of pages of information going back to about the 1950s. A very good collection, but unfortunately only in the French language. Now, by using the term government, of course, this is very broad. And it's been very specific areas of governments that have been the lead body in some countries such as Australia, New Zealand and the USA. And the task was delegated to that country's Air Force in many countries. But in others, such as the UK, it fell to defence intelligence units within the Department of Defence, who've been active both overtly and covertly with investigations. And yet in other countries, such as Chile, civilian aviation authorities have actually been the lead agency. On the screen at the moment is the front page of the website of the official Chilean government UFO group. Fortunately, most of this is in English, but also in Portuguese. But whoever has led the investigation, a similar outcome has eventuated. Governments tell us, quote, "There is no threat to national security from UFOs," unquote. And by saying this, various governments have been able to wash their hands of researching the UFO phenomena openly. Governments have been able to withdraw from having a UFO policy. Australia had a UFO policy from the 1950s through to 1994, when overtly they told us they have stopped investigating the phenomenon. And so governments have been able to withdraw from official overt active interest. Other countries have recently, within the last few years, announced the creation of their own official UFO study groups, such as Argentina, who announced their study group a little while ago. But on this theme of investigations, which is the theme of the first part of my talk, I'd like to take a brief look at a number of cases which have been investigated by various governments to show you their style of interest. Firstly, this is a rendition by a Japanese pilot who, while flying over Alaska with a total crew of 3, when all 3 crew members described seeing unusual lights which at times illuminated the cockpit. And then the pilot here has drawn an image of what he saw behind the lights in terms of the square objects. He manoeuvred the aircraft, the object turned, and at various stages the object was level with the aircraft, appeared to jump from one area of the sky to another, was visible on the aircraft's radar, and could simply not be identified by the three crew. Here's a sketch at another point of the observation, which went on for about half an hour over Alaska, which was drawn by one of the airline crew. Now, in terms of investigation, so this is an official American investigation, federal aviation authorities, which are the equivalent of our airline watchdogs, including the divisional chief of the Accidents, Evaluations and Investigations Division of the FAA, looked into this particular incident. The relevant radar data from the ground was obtained, and a chap called John Callahan, who was the division chief at the time, found there were primary targets on radar which were in roughly at the same time and at the same place as the visual observations. So here we had the American government looking at what was sightings of an unusual object by an airline crew, seen both visually and on radar. And Callahan, who was the chief investigator for the government at the time, in a book by Leslie Keane, a journalist, said that radar specialists were in conflict as to the cause of the radar data. Hardware engineers said the radar target was a software problem. The software engineers, when interviewed, said it was a hardware problem. They denied it could have possibly been an unknown object. It was either a problem with the software or a problem with the hardware. But what did Callahan conclude in the end? A quote from him is that during the playback of the event, I clearly observed a primary radar target in the position reported by the Japanese pilot. But the radar signals were intermittent because the UFO was painted as an extremely large primary radar target because the FAA computer system tracking the UFO returned the object as a weather phenomena. But regardless, the target could be seen near the 747 aircraft on and off for a total of 31 minutes. So that was Callahan's official government perspective. And finally, when the report was come out by the US FAA, that report concluded that the radar returns were simply a split image due to a malfunction in the radar equipment, which showed occasionally second blips that could be mistaken for an unknown object. And it was just coincidence that the split image matched the position of the object being reported by the pilots. Now we're going to jump to New Zealand. This is the type of aircraft in Argosy from which the following observations were made. An Australian film crew, you may remember this back in the late 1970s, an Australian film crew above this aircraft and the crew of the aircraft observed and filmed a number of apparently anomalous lights in the sky. Unusual radar returns were also reported, and the television station which the film crew belonged to here in Melbourne actually brought out US researcher Bruce Maccabee, an optical physicist, who was sponsored to visit New Zealand, interview people who had seen the things visually, obtaining radar data, weather details, and then he published a detailed research report about the case. However, it is the response of the New Zealand government that I'd like to draw attention to here. So the US government wiped off observations by the Japanese crew as simply something with a glitch with the radar and totally ignored the visual observations. Here in New Zealand, we have another situation. Bruce Maccabee published an article in the professional journal Applied Optics because he was an optical physicist. But the New Zealand Airforce and the New Zealand Department of Scientific and Industrial Research also looked into the events. They interviewed primary witnesses, they examined the radar data. And what did the New Zealand Air Force tell us they thought had been seen? Maura's having a good laugh down here. A direct quote from the New Zealand Air Force. The unidentified radar and visual sightings reported by aircraft and the air traffic control radars of the northeast coast of the South Island recently are the results of natural but unusual atmospheric phenomena. I'm going to show you a reproduction of a single frame of a film that was taken by the Australian film crew. So it's just a tracing of what was on one single frame. Now, the New Zealand Government Department of Scientific and Industrial Research prepared a number of papers on the observations of the film crew and the airline crew and the radar observations, bearing such impressive titles as, quote, "Optical qualities of the windows of Argosy aircraft in relation to photograph with the lenses of large aperture," unquote. Nowhere you'll notice is the word UFO ever mentioned. And this particular report examined photographs of one of the brightest objects taken by the Australian film crew. And the government in New Zealand concluded that the object was most likely due to imperfections in the aircraft windows, causing natural external light sources to appear abnormal. Another article appeared in the journal Applied Optics. What is good is that this was being played out in science journals. This rarely happens. So whatever you think of the New Zealand government's opinions, at least this was being published where science and scientists could read, discuss and debate. And a second report which was called Photometric Properties of an Unidentified Bright Object Seen off the Coast of New Zealand. Again, you notice no one is using the term UFO. But this report concluded that the most likely source of the bright light was a number of squid boats on the ocean surface. And this government analysis disputed that of Bruce Maccabee and suggested that the observations were not inconsistent with a near stationary surface object. So here we have another government who has looked into what are classic UFO sightings with film evidence and concluded that there was nothing, absolutely nothing abnormal about what was being reported. Next, we're going to jump over to France. These are poor reproductions, unfortunately, from the official GPAN website. You can go to the website, you can download a PDF file with their sighting and investigation report, and unfortunately, when you copy the pictures, this is the nature of what you get. But it'll give us a bit of an idea. There was a place called Trans-en-Provence, where a man watched an unusual object rapidly descending with a whistling sound and land in his yard very close to him. This is the sketch of what he said actually landed there. After a few minutes, the object whistled again and took off. And immediately after its departure, a circular ground imprint was noted. Again, sorry, a poor reproduction, but on the bottom right-hand side, you can see a vague circular outline, which the gentleman said was found in the location where the object had left from. The French police, the gendarmerie, interviewed the witness fairly promptly, collected soil and vegetation samples, and the samples were analysed by various French government-owned laboratories. Nice if you can do that. Analysis of the soil indicated that strong mechanical pressure had been applied to the soil. Analysis of vegetation revealed changes to chlorophyll levels and other signs which seemed to suggest accelerated aging of plants. So here, all in all, the French government investigation suggested the involvement of an unknown phenomenon, and it wasn't a problem to them to actually say they didn't know what caused it. Now we skip to Mexico. Here is an aircraft involved in the following sighting. Back in 2004, a surveillance aircraft of the Mexican Department of Defense was conducting operations where the crew initially observed visual targets on their infrared equipment. They were invisible to the naked eye. They could not see them from the aircraft. They were on their infrared equipment, but they also picked up radar targets. Who went about investigating this? Interestingly, US researcher Bruce Maccabee was the person who took the most detailed look at this particular sighting. And his research indicated to him that the first object detected by the plane's radar system remained unexplained. Here we have an actual image from the equipment on board the aircraft, which is an infrared image. Bruce Maccabee did say, though, that when he investigated this particular case, which seemed to have some good technological support in terms of infrared images and radar detection, was that he felt that some of the radar targets seemed to be reflections from objects on the ground. You can get radar beams bouncing off ground objects and then being picked up from the air. And he felt that many of the forward-looking infrared sightings were actually of objects much further away than the aircraft crew believed. And he thought in the end, and here's a map of the area concerned, he thought in the end that actually some of these infrared images may well have been of distant oil field gas burn-off flames. So here's an optical physicist doing a detailed investigation of a Mexican official government aircraft crew reporting infrared targets and radar targets. And Bruce Maccabee, who is a UFO researcher of great renown, he's saying that maybe there were some UFOs here, but possibly some of the objects may have been explained by mundane causes. Here we have the front cover of the July 1990 issue of a journal from the Mutual UFO Network in the US. Many of you will probably have read about the famous wave of sightings in Belgium at that stage. And the gentleman in charge of the Belgium Airforce at the time, Major General Wilfred de Broer, had a look into this wave of sightings in his own country. And he said there were something like 143 UFO reports made by several hundred citizens in a short period of time, mainly of unusual triangular-shaped objects. A sketch of some of the objects involved from the report. So the question here is we're looking at, again, government investigations. We've been to New Zealand, Mexico, France, we're now in Belgium. So did the Belgium Air Force actually investigate these sightings? And the answer, surprisingly, is no. The General Brower said that, quote, although the Defence Minister insisted on a transparent approach, especially to show the public that there was no cover-up, the Air Force was not authorised to establish a dedicated office for conducting its own inquiries. A close-up sketch of one of these triangular objects that was being seen. So if the Belgian government didn't permit its own Air Force to investigate, what actually did they do? Well, amazingly, they went to a UFO group in Belgium called SOBEPS, S-O-B-E-P-S is the acronym, and supported by the Belgium Air Force, scientists associated with this particular civilian UFO group were encouraged to investigate on behalf of the government, a very different approach to many other countries. And their end conclusion was that numerous incidents from this wave of sightings of mainly triangular objects over Belgium were unexplained at the end of the investigations. So let's summarise it up. We've got 5 examples here that show the diverse response by national governments to reported UFO events. The US government was dismissive of their Alaska sighting. The New Zealand government certainly suggested mundane causes for what was being reported in their country. Interestingly, the French government conducted a serious investigation, absolutely professional. They published details of what they had learnt, and I believe there's probably been no suggestion that they decided to cover anything up there. And finally, the Belgian government cooperated with a civilian UFO group, which is practically unheard of. Later I'll be coming back to what's happened in Australia over the years. But I'd like to skip next to a section which I've called the approach of science. Now, science as a field of human endeavour had its big chance to contribute to our knowledge of the UFO phenomena back in the 1960s. The report cover I showed you, the 1,000-page report sponsored by the United States Air Force. So it had a chance because it employed a civilian university to actually investigate on behalf of the United States Air Force the subject of UFOs. But the problem was that it failed to contribute. And I doubt if many of you have read the full report of what was called the University of Colorado's UFO investigations. Still available on eBay, you can buy it on Amazon. It's worth a read. It's got lots of hard science in it, but most interestingly, it was spread over a couple of years and it cost multi-hundreds of thousands of dollars. One of the most expensive studies that's been done so far of the whole topic. But I hear you say in the audience, it was actually sponsored by the United States Air Force, so can we trust it? It was supposed to be a scientific review of the subject. But what few people realise is that if you look at the actual contract between the United States Air Force and the University of Colorado, they wanted 2 and only 2 questions answered, not a broad scientific review. They were sponsored to find out whether or not UFOs were a threat to national security. Of course, this was being sponsored by an Air Force, so they want to know about security. And the second question they asked the University of Colorado to resolve was whether the further study of UFOs would contribute anything to scientific knowledge. So it wasn't a total scientific review. It's A, national security, B, should we spend any more money studying the phenomena? And no surprise, even if you haven't heard of or haven't read this study, the answer to those 2 questions was no and no. No, there was no threat to national security, and no, it wasn't worth throwing any more science at the topic. And that has been the official position of the United States Air Force and the United States government since the late 1960s, many, many years back. The problem was that when you take a look at this study, if you do read the 1,000 pages of very small print, you'll see the study is actually flawed. The overall conclusion is published at the front of the study, and that conclusion does not reflect the content of the rest of the report. And when you count up the, say, 120 cases that they looked into, these were psychologists, psychiatrists, physicists, and other specialised scientists who looked at these cases, about 1/3 of the cases remained unidentified after they'd studied and analysed them, which is an extraordinarily high amount, given that in Australia the Air Force used to say that only 3 to 4% of Australian cases remained unidentified after analysis. So despite their answers, no, it's not a security threat, and no, we shouldn't put any more science at it, the report itself, when you read it, doesn't actually reflect no and no. It actually suggests yes and yes. So how they got away with it is anyone's guess, but they did. And since that date, in the late 1960s, science as a field of study hasn't taken another detailed look at the topic. What's interesting is that some individual scientists have privately studied the subject, and many who study it find it has unexplained aspects. And I'd like to briefly mention 2 such individual scientists of whom you may or may not be aware. This is the front cover of a book by a chap called Harley D. Rutledge, and he was the chairman of the physics department of the Southeast Missouri State University. And he became aware of a number of UFO reports coming in from an area called Piedmont of his state. The reports of stalled cars, people having close encounters, television signals being interfered with, and literally crowds of people were swarming to the area every night to look at UFOs. Now, as a scientist at a university and trying to maintain a reputation as a physicist, he had to weigh up carefully whether or not he was going to do what civilian UFO researchers do, that is, go into the field and actually talk to people and look at these things for themselves. But actually at the end he decided to do so, and a number of his colleagues went out into the field and saw UFOs for themselves. They observed anomalous lights both from the ground, they hired an aircraft, chased some of these lights in an aircraft, took spectral of them, and over the next several months about 35 scientists, engineers and students from the university went out into the field and studied UFOs live. And they're able to measure such useful pieces of information as angular size, angular velocity, calculated the heights and trajectory of some of these objects. And then they actually demonstrated that a scientific team with equipment could see, photograph and get data on anomalous lights and to a lesser extent structural objects, some of which were seen during the day. He published a book about it, asked his scientific colleagues to look at it, and there was dead silence. He'd been brave enough to go out and have a look himself, put his reputation on the line, published a book, said you can study these things scientifically. No one was interested in terms of scientists. Didn't stop another colleague of his called Frank B. Salisbury. He was also an individual scientist, and his speciality was botany and biochemistry at the University of Utah. And in Utah, there was a series of daytime and nocturnal observations of both lights and structural objects, some seen at very close range. And again, as a scientist, putting his reputation on the line, he decided to go to the area, conduct personal interviews, and just take a look for himself. He started off being extremely skeptical that there could be anything unusual or abnormal being reported. But the conclusion at the end of his book, which presents a lot of hard data, was, quote, "I could not think of any reasonable explanation to account for the objects sighted in the Unitah Basin except for extraterrestrial machinery," unquote. He interviewed individuals about their sightings over the next 20, 30 years. He did a close study of a location nearby, which you might have heard of, called the Skinwalker Ranch, which had a large range of anomalous phenomena, including some paranormal activity, which was studied by a group of scientists who were funded by a chap called Bigelow, who was a Las Vegas billionaire who got personally interested in the subject and funded a science team. He actually bought a property, a farming property, where things were being observed, and funded a team of people to go sit there and study what was going on. And Frank B. Salisbury did some of his own research as recently as about 4 or 5 years ago on that particular ranch. One of his observations, which has always intrigued me, is he said, quote, "The UFOs in the Unitah Basin wanted to be seen. They performed for their witnesses. They put on a display. And when we examine UFO accounts, however, we encounter events that just don't seem to fit in with our understanding of natural laws," unquote. So in summary, individual scientists have undertaken field investigations and found there are indeed anomalies to investigate. However, science as a whole continues to tell us that there's nothing unknown about these phenomena. And hard science, you'll find it very difficult to find many articles about our topic in professional refereed science journals these days. And before I close my first section and we have a bit of a talk about what I've just been speaking about, what about private enterprise? There's always the enterprising CEO, someone in their 20s, who takes a burning interest in this particular topic and decides to do their own research. Well, one private enterprise did a study, and one of their scientists, who was interested personally in the topic, went to his boss and said, "I want $500,000 US from you to study UFOs." Now, if I went to my boss and said that, I'd be out the door within 5 seconds. But his boss said, "Okay, here's $500,000, take 3 years, go away and study UFOs." What did McDonnell Douglas hope to get out of it? They hoped to discover technology. They hoped to discover advanced propulsion systems. UFOs are reported to jump around from here to there or even disappear in front of you. And he thought he could learn something about propulsion systems. And so they invested this money on the hope of discovering clues to advanced propulsion systems, which they could then duplicate. They studied reports from witnesses, reviewed the UFO literature, and even created a purpose-built UFO detection van to chase over California to undertake trips looking for hard data on UFOs. This is a page from one of the memos of the report. The report actually wasn't made public until around the year 2000, when the chap who went to his boss and asked for the $500,000 said, "Oh, by the way, we conducted a study years ago and here's our 500-page report," and put it on the internet. Up until that stage, almost nobody had heard that McDonnell Douglas had undertaken this private study. Ultimately, though, unfortunately, the work did not lead to any breakthroughs at all. The author of the report, Robert Wood, he's still alive today, he's in his 90s. He's active in UFO research. But here's a study by private enterprise. So we've looked at governments, science, private enterprise. I want to take a break there and take any questions on that segment rather than wait for the end. Let's see if I can do this. Apart from Moira, who's got her hands up, who's going to be talking, so I'm just going to ignore her for a second. I'll come back to you, Moira. Questions on government's involvement. Who'd like to start us off for a few minutes to talk about that particular area of interest? Don't all rush at once. Okay, Moira's got a hand up.
I just wanted to comment on the black triangles over Belgium. There was quite a bit of controversy, and you probably know more about it than I do. At one stage, the Belgian government accused the Americans of testing their prototypes over Belgium, over their airspace. But then other researchers said, no, if it was an American prototype, there was too many of them at any one time, that if those black triangles, which created enormous interest at the time, if they were a prototype, there would have only been one or two. But in Belgium, they were seeing quite a lot of them in different parts of the country. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, because you've probably done more research on it.
That's an interesting question. So around the world, is technology that belongs to governments causing some of the reports? The Belgian government, true, went through the US Air Force air attaché in Belgium to go back to the United States government to ask, are any of your advanced aircraft overflying Belgium? The United States Air Force, as you might expect, came back and said no. Now here in Australia, we do have some advanced technology that's being flown. So for example, it was only recently that the ABC reported that some American drones were flying out of the Edinburgh Air Force Base in South Australia, just up the road from where I live. And those advanced drones had flown across from America, flown across the Pacific, being remotely piloted, landed at Edinburgh, stocked up, refueled, and then taken off for Afghanistan and back. And those drones were flying over South Australia at night. And if it wasn't for a group of aviation amateurs in Adelaide who actually heard some of the transmissions, picked up some of the transmissions, thought they were odd, went out to Edinburgh, sat at the end of the airfield, saw these drones taken off in the middle of the night, the ABC wouldn't have been able to report that those drones were flying over South Australia. Recently in Woomera, again in South Australia, we've had the world's first French and British-made supersonic unmanned drones being tested at Woomera. So in that area, you'd expect them to be flying over a restricted zone in Woomera, which is something like about a quarter of our state, is a restricted military zone for flying from missiles and things from Woomera. So yes, there are technology which is being tested that governments don't want to talk about at the time. But to come back to Maura's question, Certainly the US government denied they were flying anything over Belgium at the time which could have caused these reports. Lady on my left here, Ada.
Yes.
I'll just come round and give you the mic. There we go.
When UFO Research did some away trips to Barraba, which is a country, a very small country town outside of Tamworth. I don't know if you've heard of
Yes.
it. Some of the locals felt that, that there are quite a few UFO sightings, but there is also anonymous craft sightings. Now, Barraba is sort of close to the Williams Air Force Base, and one of the ladies who lived about 30 kilometres out of town said that they often had flyovers of the F-11s and all that sort of thing. But what I did, you're familiar with John Ockertell?
Yes.
He's involved in some sort of aircraft security or something. I asked him if there could be any sort of prototypes or things like that flying in that area to account for some of the sightings. Now, I think the name of it, because I haven't got my notes here, I think the name of was it Bluebird? He wondered if they were testing some of the American prototypes from Williamstown. I just wondered if you're familiar with that. I might even have the name wrong.
No, I'm not in that instance, but for example, just coming back to my own state again, there were, a friend of mine was monitoring some of the air traffic control frequencies, and he heard in the middle of the night, was always about 11 o'clock at night, something like Bluebird heading north. And no more transmissions that were available, and then 3 o'clock in the morning, Bluebird heading south, and you often wondered what that was, because when you looked at the WebTrack secondary radar website, which you can look at, which tracks any aircraft which have got transponders on, military aircraft may or may not be using transponders at any particular point. So certainly it could well be that some of the observations that we would think were UFOs are being caused by aircraft. But you would question, as Moira pointed out, why would you fly them over civilian areas if you've got, as in we have in our state, a quarter of the state you can just fly around in with hardly anyone living there to see it. So it is a question.
Yeah, very sparsely inhabited though.
Yes, yeah, very, very sparsely inhabited through there. I'll move on to my next section. So if we've looked at governments, and we've looked at science, and we've looked at private enterprise, what's left? Well, the most important segment is us, civilian UFO groups. We're not government, we're not science, we may be scientists, we don't represent science as a whole, and we're certainly not private enterprise. As you'll be much aware, money goes out of our pockets and not into it. And you'll notice that none of the cases which I've covered so far have mentioned anything other than objects in the sky or near or on the ground. There are no abduction and no contactee experiences being talked about so far. And this is because individuals who report things to government agencies, air forces, to science or private enterprise almost exclusively only report objects and not interactions between entities and themselves as witnesses. So it's not until we look at our fourth approach to the subject, that is investigation by civilian UFO groups, that we start to encounter other than simple objects. But even here, out of all the incoming raw reports that civilian UFO groups get, by far the biggest percentage is still of objects and not interactions with entities. And for this reason, in this talk, I'm going to continue to speak mainly of sightings or reports. That is, observations by individuals of objects in the sky or on or near the ground. And in tomorrow's workshop, I'll go into discussions of more complex reported sightings and cases and experiences such as abductions and contactees. And over the years, there's been a large number of civilian UFO groups who have attempted to collect UFO reports on a global scale. In former years, you'll see acronyms tossed around such as APRO and NICAP. And today, perhaps the most well-known is MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network based in the USA. But there are also organisations which focus on one specific facet of the phenomena, such as a group called NARCAP. This is the NARCAP front homepage of their website. NARCAP stands for the National Aviation Reporting Centre on Anomalous Phenomenon. They don't use the word UFO. They collect sightings from sightings from pilots, reports from pilots and aircrew, only in American registered aircraft, wherever they are, anywhere in the world. So they have a narrow focus, unlike a lot of civilian UFO groups. So I'd like to take a look at investigation as conducted by some of these civilian groups. And firstly, we're going to go to the English Channel. This happened in 2007. A Captain Ray Boyer, a pilot of 5,000 flying hours experience, was piloting a passenger aircraft. When crossing the English Channel, he and his passengers saw two unidentified objects. They were picked up apparently on ground radar from two different locations, and one object was observed by another pilot from a different geographic position. Here's a sketch of what the pilot said he saw of one of the objects. They were both very similar to this. Extremely long, thin things. And on a clear afternoon, he said he saw a brilliant yellow light close to the horizon where none should have been. He had the opportunity of viewing it through binoculars, and it looked like a thin cigar with a ratio of length to width of about 15:1. And it had sharply defined edges and pointed ends. And a second identical object was seen at a distance beyond the first. And they were lost to view by both himself and several of the passengers on the aircraft when the plane came down to land. Interestingly, in the UK, pilots do report UFOs to the English Civil Aviation Authority. But it was UFO researchers that made the most detailed study. This is just a page from the official report to the Civil Aviation Authority. But UFO researchers studied the visual observations, interviewed the pilot, a couple of the passengers, got the air traffic control radar data and weather data. What was interesting that they could find nothing on the weather radar that would account for the two sightings of the two objects. Sorry. This was the technical report that was put out by the UFO research group NARCAP, and an examination of the air traffic control radar data, as opposed to the weather data, turned up no clear evidence of anything anomalous in terms of weather propagation that day. However, ultimately the radar data itself wasn't useful in establishing the presence of an unusual phenomenon. The researchers considered explanations such as sundogs, sub-suns, sunray patches on the sea, aircraft condensation trails, greenhouse specular reflections, but in the end they concluded that the two objects were simply unknown. We jump now to Chicago in the USA. Here's just a scene from our next report. This happened in 2006 when a number of airline employees and others reported seeing a round, revolving, grey-coloured metallic-looking object hovering over the O'Hare Airport in Chicago. And based on the known height of the cloud base, the object was at a height of less than 1,900 feet and was there for at least 3 minutes before it departed at speed, and as it went up through the cloud level, a hole formed in the cloud where it went through the cloud. NARCAP investigated, and they used the American Freedom of Information Act to obtain some of their documentation. They obtained eyewitness testimony from the ground witnesses. They obtained copies of recorded transcripts of conversations between air traffic controllers and crew that were loading, unloading aircraft. And the control tower operators said they didn't see anything. And then they said there was actually nothing observed on radar. Front page of a very detailed NARCAP report, very technical, and their opinion from the official FAA was that the whole thing was a weather phenomena that hovered, looked like a metallic disc, shot out through the clouds, left a hole in the cloud. But the group, NARCAP, they said, right, let's start from scratch. Let's see if we can exclude things like weather balloons, which they did. A US military aircraft, they eliminated it. Things like lenticular clouds, a helicopter. And in the end, after going through all the possible conventional explanations, NARCAP, as a civilian UFO group, simply concluded it was an unknown object. They could not account for it. Now you'll have noticed in quite a few of the cases I've been describing, there's mention of radar data. In our next case, which happened in 2008 at a place called Stephenville in Texas, the group that investigated MUFON, a civilian UFO group, actually under the Freedom of Information Act was given radar data to have a look at for themselves. So they had a radar expert look at this radar data. Visually, the object was described as a very large, bright, silent object passing across this particular area of Texas, seen for several minutes by dozens of people. MUFON put investigators out into the field, tracked down people, interviewed them, sat down, studied it all, looked at the radar data, and MUFON's conclusion in the end was that the radar data actually supported the presence of two unknown objects. So here we have a difference between the opinion of government, the opinion of science, the opinion of private researchers, and the opinions of UFO researchers. So let's jump to what's happened in Australia over the years. And our official investigation body was the Royal Australian Airforce. And sometimes the Royal Australian Airforce went out into the field to look at waves of sightings here in Australia. Here's a newspaper clipping from 1983, when the Air Force was at its most active getting out and about investigating. This comes from Bendigo in Victoria. Now, the Air Force and other areas of the Department of Defence officially looked at the subject of UFOs between 1951 and when they gave it away officially in 1994. And the Air Force was the only officially nominated area of the Australian government reportedly receiving and investigating reports from the public, commercial airline pilots, air traffic controllers, as well as its own personnel. And other Australian government departments did maintain files on UFOs, but these were mainly administrative type files. The only other government department which collected UFO sightings was the former Department of Civil Aviation. So the Air Force, quite unusually at Bendigo, got, I think it was Flight Lieutenant Brett Binnington out into the field. He spent about a week there, he interviewed people, he obtained copies of weather data, he spoke to people who'd taken photographs, he had a look at photographs, and the Air Force overall collected reports of sightings and attempted to attribute a cause to the sightings. And they did their work. They had a network of base-level intelligence officers, part of whose job it was to collect and look at UFO reports. Interestingly, you'll notice the use of intelligence officers as opposed to any other area of the Air Force. And there were a few instances where the Air Force actually dispatched aircraft to check out reported UFOs. Here in Sydney, you may or may not be aware that some years ago the Air Force put on standby a couple of jets to chase objects that were being reported on the radar system at the airport here. Things were being seen by civilian air traffic controllers speeding over northern Sydney, heading north at speeds of thousands of miles an hour. The Air Force came down and sat down with the air traffic controllers to do a bit of an investigation. But that's one of the few times that I know of that the Australian Air Force had put jets on standby to chase UFOs, and it happened right here in Sydney.
What year was that?
That was 1983, the same year, 1983, as they sent out Brett Bridlington to Bendigo. There was a large volume of sightings all over Australia in that year. And what did the Air Force call this operation of putting aircraft on standby? Operation Close Encounters. And there's actually a file in the National Archives of about 60 or 80 pages long describing what they did and what they found. The report comes to the conclusion that the civilian air traffic controllers, expert in radar, didn't know the difference between radar picking up an object in the sky and radar having a glitch. The Air Force concluded the air traffic controllers' radar system was showing them glitches and not UFOs. And essentially, RAAF investigation findings were that the vast majority of reports could be explained in mundane terms, and that the percentage of, quote, unknowns, unquote, UFOs to us, in their files was only in the neighbourhood of 3 to 4% of all incoming reports. And I know of no known overt major scientific investigation of UFOs by the Australian government. It hasn't happened. And I've spent considerable time studying the RAAF's UFO files, the Department of Defence's UFO files, and a range of UFO-related files held by government agencies that no longer exist, and by agencies such as ASIO. ASIO, in fact, had files on UFO researchers, not on UFOs, but on researchers. And there are actually some fascinating unexplained reports in their own files. They just didn't want to say they were unexplained and interesting because that wasn't their brief. If you go to the Air Force's files, you're allowed to see documents such as this, which are questionnaires filled out by people who are making UFO reports. They've been redacted for name purposes under the Privacy Act. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of these kind of questionnaires in the Air Force's own files. And only at one stage was a government body, the CSIRO, asked by a civilian UFO group if they would establish a scientific research study in Australia. And you can imagine that the result was the CSIRO declined to do so. And so today, there's no Australian government agency admits to openly studying our topic, the subject of UFOs. There may be some ongoing covert study somewhere, but although I've looked long and hard for such a covert study, I'm not aware of such a one. Now, having said that, apart from looking at government files that are available, there is the ability of every citizen, you included, to submit a Freedom of Information request if you believe Freedom of Information requests will get you information out of the government. But a colleague and I, Paul Dean, who's in Melbourne, have actually put quite a number of FOI requests into areas of the government, such as the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, which looks after the safety of all commercial air flights in this country, Air Services Australia, which is the air traffic control system that looks after the actual mechanics of getting a plane from A to B. And we've done that over several years, and we've demonstrated that within the current documents and files of current government bodies, there are interesting reports. They don't call them UFOs. For example, the Air Force, using the Jindalee over the horizon radar system, will talk about contacts of interest. Contacts of interest. The Air Force no longer talks about UFOs. They talk about other things such as contacts of interest. If you talk to Air Services Australia, they have their own terminology. You talk to the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, you tell them what you're looking after, namely UFO reports, and they'll say, yes, UFO reports. We've got some unknown objects, reports of objects in our system. What would you like from our databases? And so Paul and I have actually got quite current documents as late as 2015, where you'll find documents relating to an encounter between an aircraft and an unknown object, which will be simply wiped off and not investigated by the official government bodies. And interestingly, back in March 2014, there was a near miss in broad daylight, early morning, clear sky, near Perth International Airport, between a passenger aircraft and an unknown object. That was investigated by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau because it nearly hit the aircraft and would probably have hit the aircraft unless the pilot had done a fairly swift manoeuvre. And they concluded that the cause of the sighting, or the cause of the need for the aircraft to swerve, was in fact, quote, an unknown object, unquote. Now, if an unknown object is not a UFO, I don't know what is, but they just didn't want to use that term. Here in Australia, there's been civilian UFO interest since 1947, the year Kenneth Arnold reported his classic encounter, which started off the current modern UFO phenomena. But formal groups actually entered the picture at the beginning of the 1950s and obviously continue today, meeting here, one of those groups. And both state and national level UFO groups have existed and continue to exist today, a testimony to the long-lasting interest amongst civilians in Australia over the last 69 years. And at times over the years, we've had a number of national level groups. We've had groups with acronyms such as AFSRS, CAPIO, UFORI, ACUFOS, and AUFORN, AUFORN. AUFORN is our current national level investigation group based in Brisbane. And here, civilian UFO researchers, their investigation methods have been about to attempt to capture, collate, and analyse incoming reports at a national level, where people go out into the field, investigate, and then publish their findings. And for those who may have heard or not have heard of AUFORN, I actually got in touch with one of the chaps who runs AUFORN, Daniel Sims, and I said, I'm going to give a bit of a talk to a UFO group. Tell me something I can tell them about AUFORN. How would you say, how would you describe yourself? How would you say what you do? So this is a quote from Daniel Sims. AUFORN has undergone some significant changes in the last 3 years. It's currently overseen by myself and Robert Frohler. We're a non-profit organisation. A lot of people come and go, choose to volunteer in investigations. And we believe that our current role is publishing the Ufologist magazine, which you may or may not have seen on newsstands and through newsagents. It's a bi-monthly publication, usually about 72 pages, full of information about the topic of our interest. And in return for their efforts, we provide the opportunity for our volunteers to have their sightings, research or articles published, promoted and fully credited to them. We used to have an 1800 telephone sightings report hotline, and that's come to an end. Over the last 10 years, we used to research 60 to 80 calls a month for many years, and that's been slowly decreasing as social media has become a prominent source for communications. So he summarises what AUFORN is here for: to enable others to supply articles, research and investigation reports, so that we can pack our magazine with Australian content and in return give groups full credit and publish their efforts. Now, moving away from AUFORN, besides verbal interviews, a number of groups undertook basic scientific analysis of UFO reports over the years. And some of the techniques which were used, which may or may not be familiar to you, are magnetic signature test on motor vehicles who've been involved in a close encounter, soil analysis of traces which have been found here and there, involving such complex testing as thermoluminescence, which today is used by archaeologists for dating pottery found in Egypt and other places. But many of you are probably unaware of these sort of serious Australian scientific efforts, because they were undertaken in the 1970s and 1980s. and are a far distance from the internet-driven orange globes and other phenomena which we see videoed, and we see videos on YouTubes. So we're talking way back, but way back Australian civilian researchers were actually conducting some quite serious scientific research on this topic. Today though, we have very few reported vehicle interference cases, and the majority of UFO group members probably have got no idea how to conduct a motor vehicle signature test, and similarly, with almost no ground trace reports being made at the moment, few of us would have the skills of how to take relevant soil samples and then get them analysed. And I think I can count on one hand the number of scientific consultants which are actually available to Australian UFO groups today. And to sum it up, I would say that it's fair to say that most Australian civilian UFO groups, in my opinion, have actually lost their capacity to do any real science on UFO cases these days. But let's take you through a few cases and see the sorts of things which were being done years ago by scientists associated with UFO groups. This is just the result of a magnetic signature test. You take a car where somebody said, my car was stalled by a UFO passing over it. You use a compass, you measure the direction of the residual magnetic field, which is imprinted in the metal panels of every car in the world. Car's made, metal's hot. When it cools down, it locks in the magnetic signature of the Earth's magnetic field at the location the car was made. You can do this to your own car. If you run a compass around your car, you will see it will vary at different directions depending on where you put your compass. So if somebody says the UFO stalled my car, and a physicist says it's reasonable to think that this was stalled by the application of the high intensity magnetic field, that you would do a test on the car and then some control sample cars and find out if the car shows that its magnetic signature imprinted at the factory when it was made has been altered. Great science, simple to do, use a compass. And UFO Research Far North Queensland, a group that no longer exists, interviewed a man who was driving near a place called Liverpool Creek in far north Queensland. He said he saw a dull white light, apparently sitting on the side of the road. As his vehicle drew closer, he saw the object was a dark beehive shape. It rose vertically into the sky, and at this point his car's headlights, dashboard lights and engine all failed. He stopped his car, and then mysteriously the object had gone, and the vehicle's headlights and dashboard lights came on by themselves. Shouldn't be possible. Should need a key to do that, and a switch. But he started the car engine, the dashboard lights came on, and the vehicle headlights came on, but he had to restart the car's engine in this instance. So these are three diagrams of vehicles. On the left, we have the vehicle that was involved in the observation, the sighting, and then UFO Research Queensland tracked down what they called a control vehicle. They were both Ford Falcon station wagons, and they measured the magnetic fields on both vehicles. And what they found was the vehicle where the gentleman had said a UFO stalled my car, the magnetic field of that car, and the magnetic field of another Ford Falcon station wagon, same year, as close as possible odometer-wise to mileage, was measured for its magnetic field, and the two magnetic fields were similar. So the little arrows shown on the diagrams there show you the direction that the compass points to at various points. So in this instance, with a simple compass, the test was, can we show that this vehicle has been exposed to a high intensity magnetic field? And the answer was, no, we can't show that it has. Doesn't mean to say that this was not a genuine UFO sighting, just means that the hypothesis that the engine was stalled by high intensity magnetic field was not proven. Another instance, this is the one that I had to look up myself, a remote stretch of road near a place called Kimba in South Australia. As you can see, typical scrub country, kilometres from anywhere, but 4 people in 3 separate vehicles were travelling on the same remote stretch of road, saw an unusual object on the side of the road. This was no classic disc. All these people independently reported to the local police that they'd seen an orange-red, rectangular-shaped object, 3 metres high, 1.5 metre wide, and inside the rectangle was floating a white space-suited figure. Not the sort of thing you would expect to find at night on the side of a road in the middle of South Australia. Strangely, and actually not so strangely, none of the occupants actually got out of their vehicles. They didn't stop to have a look, but they all travelled on to Kimba and they all stopped and reported it to the police. The local police constable was there at this sighting within about 45 minutes, had a look at the area, talked to the young couple who were the two primary witnesses, had a look at the ground, had a look at the surroundings, came back the next day in broad daylight, could find nothing to account for this particular sighting. Here's three of us, including the police officer at the site. I had the good fortune to actually follow this gentleman in his police car. We were doing 120 miles an hour, which was breaking the legal speed limit in South Australia at the time. But I was okay because the police were in front of me, not behind me. But he took us out there. He spent time. He said, I know the four people involved, a young couple, two truck drivers. I've taken statements. I've taken sworn statements from them. I know them. I've been out. I've had a look at the area. I have absolutely no idea what caused this observation. Question is it anything to do with UFOs? Not a classic disc, not an orange ball, not entities, a rectangle with what appeared to be a figure in a white spacesuit floating inside it. So this was one of the instances where I was talking to the young couple. You'll notice I've got a lot more hair in the photograph. But this is what civilian UFO groups are all about. It's getting out into the field and interviewing people who say these things have happened to them and trying to record and extract some useful data that we can use from them. Now we're skipping over to Western Australia. And this is a photograph I was lucky enough to find of the exact aircraft involved in our next sighting. So here we have an aircraft observation. Crew of a charter aircraft flying between Adelaide and Perth, 8,000 feet. They were at a speed of 190 knots, tracking due west just before sunset. They both saw a large object and then 4 to 5 smaller objects ahead of the plane at their flight level. They checked with ground control. There was no known traffic in the area. This was outside of controlled airspace, so therefore no radar in the area. And then suddenly, while they were watching these objects, they lost radio communications between the plane and the ground. They could not talk to Kalgoorlie DCA. And over a period of 10 minutes, as they progressed westwards, they noticed a formation of objects, and then these objects all merged into one, left at speed, and at that exact moment, the radio communications came back from Kalgoorlie. Kalgoorlie was just about to report that something unusual had happened to the plane due to loss of radio communications. The weather was fine at the time. The Air Force investigated. The Victorian UFO group in Melbourne investigated, even though this was out in WA. The pilots were one from Perth and one from Melbourne, so they heard about it from one of the pilots. So again, here's a long duration observation of something very unusual. No radar observations, but extremely bizarre. A couple of years ago, I managed to track down one of the pilots. He was living in Melbourne. I interviewed him by phone. He was still as puzzled then as he was at the time when this happened. Another WA case that happened that you might remember was that the Knowles family were travelling over the Nullarbor Plains some years ago at a place called Mundrabilla. This is a newspaper illustration based on a sketch that one of the family drew at the time. And they said they were approached by an unidentified light. A tyre on their car exploded when they took off at high speed. A mist entered the windows. There were odd smells. They felt ill and they reported finding a black dust inside their car. And their story, which they went to the media about, was that a UFO had actually lifted their car off the road. This is one of the most sort of famous Australian cases. A poor photograph of the car involved. Now here investigations were conducted by civilian UFO groups and also, interestingly, the South Australian and West Australian police forces investigated this particular case. And UFO researchers, including me, interviewed the family involved, and we tracked down 3 truck drivers who actually were on that same stretch of road at the time and interviewed them. The TV station had, in South Australia, we've got a government laboratory called the Australian Mineral Development Laboratory. On behalf of a TV station, they did an analysis. They checked for radioactivity on the car, found none. They checked the dust in the car and on the roof and found it was typical residual dust from wearing brake pads and discs, and that the burst tyre was due to the tyre having been underinflated. Part of the paid-for TV station's analysis report by this laboratory. So here we have an instance where a family said a UFO picked their car up and dropped it back onto the road, but the investigation by the police and the TV station said no mundane causes. That was their particular explanation. And one of my final cases was this one from Perth in March 2014, where a passenger aircraft was on descent to the Perth International Airport and the crew reported an approaching UFO. From the official manual of Air Services Australia, when aircraft are approaching airports, they go past what are called waypoints. The computer on board the aircraft says, autopilot, take me to this GPS point, then take me to the next GPS point, then take me to the next GPS point. And so an aircraft flies through all of these points before it turns and flies south into Perth International Airport. And what they said was at 4,000 feet, an object approached the aircraft. The pilot thought the object was going to hit his aircraft. It was reported as a long cylindrical object with a ratio of 6 long to 1 wide, and it was painted in what appeared to be a camouflaged green colour. Now, Paul Dean in Melbourne and I, we actually interviewed the pilot, obtained the weather details, and got primary and secondary radar. Secondary radar only shows aircraft which are transmitting on a transponder. Aircraft use these to avoid collisions with each other. If your transponder on your aircraft picks up a transponder from another aircraft within a kilometre, it tells you, the pilot, there's a possibility of collision. The aircraft pilot then radioed the ground, asked for permission to deviate because something was going to hit his plane. Strangely, the air traffic controller said, there's nothing on radar, you do not have permission to alter your course. Because this object was just about to hit him, he ignored his advice from the ground, swerved his aircraft, and the object passed him within 50 metres, still going upwards. We also got primary radar. Now, primary radar paints anything in the sky. Doesn't have to have an aircraft with a transponder. Anything there it should pick up. We obtained a DVD of the primary radar for the day concerned and the time concerned, gave it to a air traffic controller we know, and said to him, is there anything on radar unusual in this particular portion of the sky? He said, no. I see the aircraft, but there is no radar evidence of an object. And yet the pilot and co-pilot in broad daylight saw this object pass their aircraft. So what have we here? Something not on radar. That was a photograph of the exact aircraft involved. It was carrying 53 passengers at the time, and the object didn't trigger the aircraft's onboard transponder collision avoidance system. This is the secondary radar, a slide taken off it at the time. The little red things are aircraft. The aircraft we are looking at is the top smaller red blob, centre of the screen. The other objects are other aircraft. This is the secondary radar, which means it shows you any object emitting a transponder signal. There is nothing in front of that little red blob at all. So here you have an unknown object passing an aircraft at close range, broad daylight. What did the Australian Transport Bureau report finally say? It said it's an unknown object. So here's an official government body, looked at the case, interviewed the pilot, did all the work that we did, and said it couldn't tell us what the object was. Unknown object, UFO. That was as recently as March 2014. Now I'm going to pop on to my last section, which is talking about my own methodology. So my own methodology is about locating additional witnesses, if possible, investigating without bias, without any preconception of what the explanation might be, out of the square thinking, looking at even remote possibilities for mundane explanations, looking to locate documentation, and then putting forward a hypothesis, which is simply an idea for what may have caused the sighting. Just to give you a little bit of an example, which I'll be talking about in far more detail tomorrow at the workshop, about the sorts of tools that can be used. Here is a snapshot of a WebTrack Air Services Australia secondary radar plot of the area of New South Wales with Sydney in the bottom right-hand corner. Back in May 2015, so about a year ago now, there was a sighting at a place called Blue Haven, broad daylight, 2 p.m. An object was seen, seemed to be cigar-shaped, reflecting the sun, silver, hovering over power lines. Now, the hypothesis that I put up, that it could have been a helicopter used by the electrical transmission companies, which they fly helicopters checking out high-tension power lines. It was hovering over power lines. So a reasonable thought was, could it be a helicopter? So I went to WebTrack and said to myself, at that date, at that time, were any helicopters visible on secondary radar? In the middle, on the right-hand side on the coast, you will see a little blue shape. That is actually a helicopter, whereas the red things are aircraft, that blue one is a helicopter. So on the day and time, I was looking to see if there was a helicopter in the Blue Haven area, which, as you know, is just north of Sydney. So a reasonable hypothesis was, yes, there was a helicopter. Helicopters are used, by the way, that helicopter was travelling north up the coast. Helicopters are used for checking out tension power lines. It is conducted during the daylight. If you look at the website for the company that does the helicopter flights and checks, you will find they were scheduled to be in the Central Coast for several days around that time. So I thought it was reasonable to use those tools to think the explanation for that particular sighting was a helicopter. May or may not have been, but it was reasonable to think that. This will be more difficult to see with the lights on, and I think even switching the lights off, we're not going to get a much better viewing of it. But a lady from Townsville sent me some night shots. The moon is in the upper centre, streetlights below, and they're actually, in a dark setting, you'll see faint ovals of light in between the moon and the streetlights. And a reasonable hypothesis for these circles of lights on clouds at night at around 8 to 10 o'clock in the evening are searchlights being used to advertise. Searchlights are used for all kinds of advertising for car yards. You get laser displays on clouds these days for all kinds of activities. I put the idea forward to this lady that she may have seen searchlights, and she was quite happy with that thought. So those are just a little brief thing of what civilian UFO researchers have done in the past with science, magnetic tests, soil sample analysis, and some of the things we find today. So just to summarise my own methodology, it's about collection, collation, interpretation, dissemination, and then debate. One of the things I wanted to do some time ago is that from September 2014 to September 2015, I decided to take a look at all the raw incoming reports that were being reported all the way across Australia through UFO groups and through the media, and took a look at 12 months worth of sightings. And this is just a bit of a sample. Don't expect you to be able to read it, but it's just to give you an idea of the format of the report we were putting out onto the internet once a month. We were getting anything up to 30 to 50 raw sightings being reported through Australia, from videos to photographs to individuals to groups of individuals to reports by pilots. So we kindly had the help of groups, including this particular group here, to collect this. So over a year we got several hundred reports to get an idea of what was being reported today. And what we found is, as in the past, there were lots of observations of satellites, planets, wind-borne debris, and on the internet, lots of computer-generated fake images. Venus, Jupiter, fireballs, aircraft, you name it, people report it. And on the negative side, much of the material, and particularly that coming in via places such as YouTube and other social media, are actually of little value to someone like myself, who's seriously interested in studying the topic. And the reason for that is no one analyses it. They put out the raw data. I took this photograph. No date, no time, no type of camera used, no magnification, absolutely no detail that you can use to analyse it. But on the positive side, in that 12 months worth of collecting raw sightings from Australia, we actually did find some interesting reports. Here's one from Gilgandra, New South Wales, October 2014. A woman and her daughter going by car had an object pass by their car. Looking at it, they didn't think there was a mundane explanation for it. Another one from Tasmania, again, February 2014. A lone yachtsman off the coast of Tasmania saw a very large white to grey coloured cigar-shaped object just above the ocean in front of his boat. He radioed in at the time to the equivalent of air traffic control for boats, said what had happened, and they arranged for him to be interviewed by a civilian UFO group when he got to Hobart. The object was there for a while, and then it was lost into cloud. And despite a good investigation by the Tasmanian group, absolutely no conventional explanation. Now, from time to time, we get reports that you just can't follow up because the person who reports it to you doesn't provide contact details. Here's one from Longreach, Queensland, reported to the UFO Research Group in Queensland. And he said, tantalisingly, an egg-shaped object fell from the sky, hit the ground, started a fire. In fact, 3 fire trucks turned up to fight the fire. Unfortunately, he left no contact details. A very tantalising report, but nothing we can do much with. In America, but accessible via the internet here in Australia, is a database, electronic database for the Mutual UFO Network. So this is their case management system. You report a sighting to MUFON anywhere in the world, goes into a database, publicly available from anyone else in the world. You leave your contact details behind the scenes. The public version doesn't show you who reported it, but it does allow you to look at videos that are submitted, photographs submitted, and sighting reports. And so this is a good example of the use of electronic databases. But in fact, I have problems with these databases because today I report a sighting, tonight you can see all the details, tomorrow you say the same thing whether you did or not. Because they're publicly available so quickly, they are transmitted around the internet, and someone in Chile will read details of my sighting tonight in Chile overnight, and then somebody in Chile can quite easily hoax a report into the database, feeding a false name and contact details, and UFO researchers in Chile say, isn't this interesting? Somebody here in Chile saw the same thing as in Australia yesterday. So one of the things that I would actually recommend is we discontinue placing our raw reports into these sort of publicly available databases that are of little value to us. By all means, when you've investigated, put up your UFO cases, which will be a very small percentage of these raw reports. As I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of people have lost their desire to actually investigate incoming reports. After all, we've had them for many, many years now. So why would we bother to continue reporting when people are reporting essentially the same things which we've seen before? But having said that, it's reasonable for someone in a UFO group to be interested to spend a bit of time to investigate incoming reports. So I would urge anyone who would like to have a look at this stuff, to analyse it, to interview people, to see Mariana or one of the others on the committee and say, yeah, I'd like to be a part of investigating sightings which come into us. I would also urge people, UFO groups and individual researchers to report their material to the Ufologist magazine. It sells several thousand copies every 2 months in Australia and overseas, comes out through a newsagent, and it's a good way to advertise your group's activities or your reports. And with scientific consultants, as I mentioned, I actually would like a discussion to take place about getting science and individual scientists involved with us again, which they were in the 1970s and 80s, many, many years ago. And as Mariana mentioned, one of the projects I've been doing has been to look at regional Australia and remote Australia, contacting newspapers in those areas looking for reports. And I've gathered some very interesting classic UFO metallic discs stopping cars in places like Karratha in Western Australia within the last couple of years. No one's ever heard of these reports. People are not reporting through the traditional systems we used to have. So I'd actually recommend that groups start off a media campaign in their own state, urging people to come forward with either old or current cases, just so we can have a look at and see what's there today. And with MUFON, one of the things is there's just been a change of national directors. In Sydney now, Roger Stankovic is now the National Director for MUFON in Australia, and he's quite happy to talk to groups such as ourselves to look at reports that they've investigated and talk about some of the things which are coming through the MUFON system which are of interest. And one of the key points I like to make is my background has always been in science. My interest is in looking at the phenomena and looking at sightings on a scientific basis, and I put myself on the scientific end of the spectrum. And while I do respect the views of other people who sit at other places on this spectrum that I sit on, I don't feel that I necessarily have to agree with the views. Quite happy to sit down, chat with you, discuss with you, talk with you of views and opinions, but like everyone, I reserve my right to finally make my own mind up. So let's just summarise my talk then. Let me see. Yep. So, the UFO phenomena and research into it is anfractuous. Like you, I had to go to a dictionary to find out the meaning. Anfractuous, which is very rarely used, means full of twists and turns. But where I came across that word was a US researcher by the name of John B. Alexander, who used it in a book that he wrote about 2 years ago. He spent many years within the US government, and he was able to privately investigate UFOs in that setting. And what he said was that he concluded that UFO observations are manifestations of issues that are anfractuous, full of twists and turns, and beyond current comprehension. Photographed from South Australia many years ago, classic UFO, flying saucer, disc. That's the sort of stuff I'm interested in. And to John B. Alexander's comment about them being beyond current comprehension, I would actually add that I feel that we should still try and understand what's going on. Even if we feel it's beyond us, we still have the capacity to, in fact, look at the phenomena. And I'd urge us to do that, and that's part of the reason why we're all here today. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions?
Department of Defence look at UFOs here in Australia unofficially. He used to work for the Joint Intelligence Bureau, then the Joint Intelligence Organisation, which is now the Defence Intelligence Organisation. He was asked by the Air Force as early as the 1950s in his capacity as a physicist to help the Australian government look at UFOs. He found, like me, there were lots of fascinating stories that they never investigated, some very interesting reports, He is still alive today, so 50 years later, his view is that there is no cover-up within the Australian government. His views ally with mine, that basically the Australian government has never been openly interested in looking at the topic at all. The Air Force were just handed the job in the 1950s. They didn't want to do it. You can find government documents in the archives today where they say just that. Ah, yes, squadron leader, we know this is a stupid topic that we should be looking at, but we've been directed by the government, so put up and just do the job. But they did it very half-heartedly. So my own experiences with the Australian government, I have talked to researchers in the US, I've talked to researchers in the UK, and people in France asking the very question about their government. And only in one country in the world is there an overwhelming thought that there is a cover-up, and that's always been in the US. So if you ask US civilian UFO researchers, resoundingly they'll tell you there's a cover-up there. But then you ask the second part of your question, which is who's covering it up? And in a couple of months' time when you come here, Richard Dolan is going to give you an account of the US government's total cover-up of alien visitations. It's not a view that I personally hold, but I can only speak from my own experience here in Australia and talking to people overseas. The general feeling amongst the people who have seriously researched is if there is a cover-up, the cover-up is really well hidden. And I've not come across it here, despite going into the background of Australian interest in the topic over the years.
Pine Gap, is it a centre for alien technology?
Question was, is there a centre for alien technology at Pine Gap? I don't know. It's one of those things that's extremely difficult to find out. You can read a whole range of information about it, from people in the 1980s, Stan Deo, right through today. On the internet, the story is there's an underground base at Pine Gap, blah, 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 blah. But then what you ask is, when they were digging out this underground base, which presumably meant they had to haul away a lot of soil, where is the evidence for all the trucks taking the soil away from the big hole that was needed to sink 51 stories of infrastructure into the desert? Now that seems a strange thing to say, but it's a logical thing. Is if somebody digs a hole, they need to take the stuff away and put it somewhere. And no one can point you to the evidence of really mundane things like that. Or if there is a large base 51 stories down and there are thousands of people working there, what happens to all of the effluent from 3,000 human beings and presumably some aliens there? So logically, when you sort of follow those kind of arguments, you can say to yourself, yes, there might be, but where's the evidence for it? And I actually have no position. I don't really know there. But I know there are people who would argue that that is in fact true. So one of my points is that I'm always looking at evidence-based. Now, it doesn't mean to say I have to have a hard evidence to convince me, but it's nice if you have something that would explain where all the dirt went from the holes, where the effluent goes, where all the water going into supply several thousand people. Same with the US underground bases. You can come back and ask some really hard questions, and it's you know find it very difficult being certain of what the answer is.
Hi, I just want to ask you about your knowledge of the Westall incident in the suburb of Melbourne in 1966, where purportedly a group of school children observed an unidentified flying object land in a paddock opposite the school.
Sure.
I'll just ask your comment on that.
Yeah, certainly. The Westall happened on the 6th of April 1966. A group of about 200 students and one known teacher saw an object pass over the school, apparently touch down in a grove of trees, stay there for a while, then take off into the sky. There were reports that were about 5 light aircraft associated with that sighting. Today, one of the things I've done personally, so I'll talk personally first and then come back to be a bit broader from other people's perspectives, is with all of the search through government documents looking for evidence of sightings, there is no mention in the Department of Defence's Air Force files about Westall. There's absolutely nothing there. There is absolutely nothing else anywhere in any of the government records that I've found from about 20 government departments. So on the documentation side, according to the paperwork trail, you can't find anything. It's not to say it didn't happen, it's just to say there is no paperwork trail there. I've spoken to a number of people who were at Westall that day. I've heard the interview between the teacher and James E. McDonald. That was made about a year after the sighting. I've read all of the newspaper accounts from those days, looked at UFO magazine's accounts, and, as I say, spoken to a number of the people who were there. There's a large amount of visual evidence for something having happened. We have never found any, although there is one photograph that shows a trace from that particular area. Unfortunately, the investigation reports that were done at the time by civilian UFO groups are not available today, whether they've gone missing or whether they were ever done in the first place. So there's no trace analysis of what was in the ground, no soil samples. So the case is one where a large number of people said they saw something happen. I've actually looked at trying to find conventional explanations for it, and part of the thing which I suggested was an experiment, possible experiment by the Department of Supply, which was working with the American Atomic Energy Commission, flying large research balloons, and by large I mean 300 metres tall, over the state of Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland around that time. And I put forward just the possibility that that might have been what was sighted. That is the payload of a large balloon. The payload came down on a parachute about 40 feet diameter, white in colour, dome-shaped, and there was a flight the day before, and I tracked down and interviewed the people who launched those balloons, and no one could tell me what had happened to that particular flight on that day. They did tell me another flight of a similar object, one of these balloons, came down as close to Melbourne as Bendigo. So my short answer, that's my long answer, my short answer is I still don't know. Some of the other background things which you probably haven't heard of was that the school children were reportedly told not to talk about it by guys in suits who turned up that morning at the school. There was always rumours that they were agents from ASIO. One of the things that is little publicly known because we couldn't actually substantiate it is that we had a relative of an ASIO agent who said it was his one of the agents going there was his uncle. We tracked down some of the particulars, trying to find people in electoral rolls and so on and so forth, and drew a dead end. So we've done a bit of spade work in trying to find out what evidence one could find for Westall. Another mysterious thing, Channel 9 went and interviewed and filmed people standing outside the school that morning about what they'd seen. Although individual researchers have tracked down that TV crew and actually interviewed the people who did the filming, when they went to Channel 9 to find the film, and they just put in an archive request, the information came back. We found the container for that film, but there's nothing inside it. So if you want to be conspiracy-minded, we have a missing film, we have the possibility of school children being told by the Australian government not to talk about it, and we have no known explanation for it. So it remains a pretty good mystery. So thank you for your question. Time shortly. Draw is closed when you're ready here.
Can I just make one comment on the Westall incident? A few years ago we had Shane Ryan give us a talk, and Shane has spent many years interviewing hundreds of witnesses from that time. And he mentioned a girl, I think her name was Tanya.
That's correct.
Who ran right up to the craft and then screamed hysterically. From what we gather is her family and she were moved out of the town never to be seen again within days. One of her friends went to her home within a couple of days or more to see how she was. There was a strange woman in the house who denied having known them at all, or where they'd gone, or that they existed. So that was a really odd. Why would they be moved out of the town?
I'm just giving an update on that.
Okay.
A little update that I haven't had a chance to mention to Mariana about is that Rosie Jones, who is the documentary filmmaker for Westall 66 that was made about Shane Ryan's research, actually has traced a person she believes in, who is this Tanya. Tanya is alive and well and living in Sydney and doesn't want to talk about Westall.
Yes, yes, it's interesting. Yeah.
I just wanted to add something on Pine Gap.
Yes.
I've actually spoken to someone that worked at Pine Gap for 18 years, and they were a colleague of mine at work. And this person definitely worked at Pine Gap. And basically, I can concur with what Keith says about it. If you'd like to come and see me, I can add further information. But this person was interviewed by me for at least an hour, and everything that Keith says about Pine Gap is basically what information was given to me also.
Of course, we have to realise it's all compartmentalised at Pine Gap. And a person who works on level 1 or 2 is not going to know what happens on level 10 or 12.
Yeah, basically, there's not many people that work at Pine Gap, and it's definitely not compartmentalised.
We have diverse points of view. We have diverse points of view, and that's great. I mean, if we all thought the same thing, we'd be boring.
Wouldn't we? All right. One more question.
Keith, thanks for the talk. You mentioned when you investigate, there's no bias. But obviously you really want it to be something, right? So where's the cutoff?
Where's the cutoff in bias? I think it all boils down for me to evidence-based. So, for example, with the aircraft near miss over Perth, here's a classic example where you've got visual testimony, nothing on radar, an object goes past a plane at close range. The government body that's charged with air safety says it was an unknown object. What I didn't mention is behind the scenes we chatted to them because we wanted to get an off-the-record opinion as well. And they said, we've no idea what it is. We said, well, why don't you call it a UFO? And they say, we don't call things UFOs, we'll call them unknown objects. We'll just agree to differ. So bias is one of those things that you obviously do carry with you. My bias is towards gathering evidence and on the investigatory side and being able to see things in black and white and being able to document. But that's just my approach. It's the approach I've consistently taken over the years. But when it boils down to it, I'm here talking to people at a UFO group, and I will say there is definitely an unknown component to the UFO phenomena. Many reports are explainable, but the few that I can't explain are representative samples of some unknown phenomena. Now buy me a glass of wine and I'll tell you what I really think.